Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Parrish Art Museum live on Friday night. I'm Terrie Sultan, the director of the Parrish Art Museum, and I'm thrilled to be here with you tonight. And I want to thank our sponsors that make these wonderful programs possible. Bank of America is our presenting sponsor, along with the Corcoran Group and Steve and Sandy Pearlbinder have made it possible for us to change the Parrish Art Museum from a physical place to a digital one. And I'm very, very pleased tonight to welcome my friend and colleague, Peter Campus, who more than anyone understands what a digital space should be like.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Peter. I'm going to do a little brief introduction for you if you don't mind.
Please go ahead.
Peter is a pioneer of new media and video. He is widely recognized for his interactive video installations, single channel video works, and photography. I also want to tell you that he's a wonderful writer and poet as well. His work is in almost every major museum in the world, and of course that is including the Parrish Art Museum. Peter was born in New York. He went to a lot of movies with his father and brother in his youth. He studied development of the senses and cognitive studies at Ohio State University, where he got his degree in 1960. And after his military service, he studied film editing at City College Film Institute. And he worked as a production manager and an editor making documentaries until the early 70s. And he also worked at the Metropolitan Museum making documentaries. And we're going to talk about that a little bit. Peter's work has seen several radical shifts over the course of his more than 45-year career, from early video works in the 1970s up to work in still photography, and then a return to digital and technological innovations. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome Peter, and thank you, Peter, so much for joining us tonight. We're going to do the program in 3 sections. We're going to show some images of early work and talk a little bit about what was going on with you at the time that you were making them. Then we're going to do a sneak peek into what it's like to be in an installation, and then we're going to talk about what you're doing now. So do you have any opening statements for us?
Me? No, I'm just here to respond.
Well, let's start having a look at some pictures.
There we are.
We're starting with some really early work here. This was one of your first pieces, I think, right, Kiva?
Yes, it was 1971. And I don't know if you want me to talk about it, but there's a lot to talk about.
Yeah, well, tell us what's going on here. I mean, people see a television and a picture, and they may have a different impression of what you were thinking about when you started making this kind of work.
When I first started thinking about putting pieces in galleries, I noticed that people didn't spend much time watching videos, and at that time they were very, very long. I see we're going into the next work, but so I did a camera that pertains to this piece too. There's no videotape, no recording. It's just a camera and a projector you see on the left. And when someone walked in front of it, their image would be, in this case, reflected on mirror and then projected as a video behind on the wall.
You said something to me once about the difference between making a film, like as a director with camera in your eye, and how it was different and a little bit more distance when you started working with a camera that was not connected to a body, and then with the video, it made a different kind of disconnection.
Yeah, film and video seemed very different, and as you say, I went to film school, and you know, I got the feel of film, handled it, you know, and when I started looking at video, it seemed so totally, totally different. They're both different kinds of physics, actually. One is about the wave theory of light, and video is about the particle theory of light. So in video, particles are just hitting this Vidicon tube at that early stages and causing electrical impulses. With film, it just would pass through the film and change pigments, exposed pigments. And they were just very different. And the the machinery was very different too. Film made a lot of noise. After every so often you had to to put on a different reel. Depends. The longest it would be on films that I worked on would be 20 minutes, where video could go on for an hour or so. And video was quiet. Film, even if you put something over the camera, it made noise, kind of a click, click, click. And I noticed in interviewing people that in front of a video camera, people were much more relaxed.
The other thing about the video, and especially these works that we're looking at, there isn't any particular beginning, middle, and end. And it reminds me of the story you told about going to the movies with your dad and your brother when you were a kid, and just showing up at no particular time, and then watching the double feature. And then just when you got to the place where you'd walked in, you just said, okay, I think we came in here, and so we can go. And it seems to me that that's kind of what you're trying to get at in some of these installations too, that there's no real confined temporal aspect of the narrative of the story.
Everyone did that in the movie theater. So it was just the way it was done. And sometimes my father would have a joke where he'd sit and say to my mother, "Isn't that the guy who got killed?" You know, as they were sitting there in the beginning of a movie and people next to them had just come in. But Hitchcock ended all that with Psycho, and he insisted that people just come in on the beginning of the movie and no one would give away the end. So that's up to 1960, that's when it changed. I mean, that's pretty amazing. So all those years of movie going up to 1960, people would walk in and out whenever they wanted.
I didn't know that. Really?
Anyway, the way
was like an appointment entertainment all along, but you're saying no, you could just come in and go out. It didn't matter whether you saw the beginning of the movie or not?
Well, you generally, paid for it, so you wanted to see the beginning, but you'd go all the way through the movie, see the second feature, and then go right to where you came in, and then everyone would say, "Is this where we came in?" And if you were there with a date, there would be an usherette who would lead you into the crowded movie theater, like the Loews Valencia in Jamaica, which was just gorgeous movie theater, and seat you there, right in the middle of the movie. So Hitchcock put an end to it. Very, very smart man. But about my own work, it was, certainly had to do with that, but I think that part of it was that I wanted it to be out of time. So in movies, there's a sequence, but I wanted there not to be a sequence. So it was kind of an amalgam between photography and videography. So I started calling them videographs because they would be the same whenever you'd walk in on it. It would be the same as it would be 10 minutes later, or pretty much the same.
You said that you knew from a very young age that you wanted to be an artist. I mean, how do you know that when you're like a kid?
I have no idea. I went to a progressive school. So at age 14, I was introduced to art class, or I think age 13. And I was allowed to, if there was no class, I was allowed to sit there and paint as much as I wanted and skip all my other classes if I wanted. And I really did want to skip a lot of the other classes. So I would just sit in there until I was kicked out. And it was the most interesting thing I ever did. I mean, I really connected to it right then and knew right then that that's what I wanted to be. It took many years after that, about 20 years after that, till I became an artist. But I always knew that that's what I wanted, no matter what else I was doing.
But you didn't go to art school.
So I did never go to art school, that's true. But I went to museums on my own quite a lot. I mean, we had MoMA at that time, on still where it is now, but much smaller. And on the second or third floor, there was a door to another museum called the Whitney Museum, and you could just walk in there for free and see what their collection looked like. And of course, the Metropolitan Museum was amazing, also much smaller at the time. But there's a lot of education there.
It seems like there's a lot of painterly influence in your work, even though it's not made with paint. You know, two things that strike me about the sequence of the earlier works that we were just looking at is they are very inward looking. They're very psychological. They have a lot of calmness to them, but they also have a lot of power,
Angst.
and it's a lot of, you know, a lot of feeling that you're making a real connection, you know, whether it's to yourself or, you know, thinking about your triple portrait and how each one of those three portraits kind of shows you in a different way. And then the head of a man with death on his mind, I think, was the last video you made in that particular period. Is that right?
I made three at the same time, but those were the last ones. And that work is, I mean, now just about 83, looking back in my career, and that work seems very strong to me still. I made it in 76. My father had died in 74, and I was just trying to work it out. And worked with the actor John Erdman, and we just worked on it and came up with that. The title came later, and someone whose name I won't mention, who writes for the New York Times, criticized me for the name. But I think it was a good name. And certainly it seems like a good name right now, since we're all sitting around thinking about, you know, is it my turn now?
I know. You know, it's interesting about titles to works of art. I think of Interface, Three Transitions, and Head of a Man. They give you like a little bit of a doorway into what you as an artist might have been thinking when you made the work, but it doesn't give you so much information that it closes off interpretation or, you know, various ways of us as viewers of experiencing the work.
I like words, and if you think back to the late 60s, early 70s, Untitled was people's favorite title. Or I used to know it in German too. But and that was kind of a cop-out, but I think I did some untitled work in my, no, maybe not. I can't think of any.
I didn't see anything that was called Untitled. The minimalists, of course, were very using that word a lot because they didn't really want to give anybody any hints about anything.
Right. Yes. At one point, I decided to name pieces using 3-letter combinations from license plates. But I couldn't resist. They all wound up having meaning anyway. So one I called AEN, but that was like ain, and it was a bit like pain. One I called, I don't know, what some of the ain less than, I can't remember the name of the third one. Yeah, I couldn't resist. Words are really fun and interesting.
Yeah, they are. It's true, and I know they can be inspiring, and so can other things that you see and read. You wrote that you were talking about Ingmar Bergman's movie, The Magician, that he made in 1958, and you said that it was a piece that's set in a time when science was gaining ascendancy and forms the opposition of science against art. I, meaning you, it would seem that the nature of one to be the opposite of the other, but I have never found that to be true. What did you actually mean about in writing that as it relates to your work?
It sounds like the definition of my life. I mean, I don't see why science and I don't know what word we want to use, not religion, but that's always a hard one, but science and belief can't work out together. I mean, Einstein believed in God, and he wrote this incredible amount of physics. So I think it's possible, but in my work, I'm thinking of two things. I mean, I'm definitely thinking of science often. When those early days of video, I was certainly thinking of the physics as well as the deeper meanings of the pieces. I was always trying to keep them simple and let them reveal the meaning, but keep the installations kind of direct and simple, so that the science was observable.
Thinking of
I'm,
inspiration, yeah?
that's your Terry Gross question, or one of them, because
One of them.
it really hits it perfectly. You know, that those two strands are inside of me.
That pretty much govern your whole approach to art making, and I'd say that your approach to art making is pretty much the same as your approach to everyday life.
Oh, much better than everyday life. Everyday life is tough. Art's easy.
You think so?
Well, no, art's a real struggle. I'd like to tell students that you have to be courageous to be an artist. And I even mean just in the construction of an art piece. I mean, you have to have the guts to see it through. And if everything's telling you to go in a direction and it seems really wrong, you still go in that direction. When I gave up video and started in with photography, the first thing I did, I had loved 19th century photographs like Watkins, that, you know, where they'd spend months in hiking through nature and photographing. And so I got in my Chevy Malibu and drove to Harriman State Park with a 5x7 camera and started photographing, thinking I wanted to be like a 19th century photographer and make black and white 19th century photographs. And I let myself do that for years after working in video. And that too was a good step. You know, that too led me in the right direction. Not immediately, but for a while. Eventually.
Let's have a look at some pictures of some installations, because you mentioned installation, and this is something that a lot of people don't ever really get a chance to hear an artist talk about, in terms of, there's the making of the object, but then there's also how you govern how that's going to be seen in a museum and how your audience is going to understand what you're trying to say. And you have mentioned that when you worked for the Metropolitan Museum and you were making documentary films, one of the takeaways from that was that it gave you a sense of what a moving image in an art museum might be like and how it could be presented and understood. So you want to talk a little bit about these next images that we're going to see?
Yeah, sure. Now we're back to Kiva, but Kiva directly came from my work at the Metropolitan. I was asked to put a TV screen basically that size into my first project was Shang Dynasty bronzes, and to do a little video about them and to see how the little video would work with sitting next to the Shang Dynasty bronzes. And it was interesting. It was interesting how to find a balance between the two. But I must say no one in the museum was interested but me and Thomas Hoving, who was the director at the time. But it led me right to, this is another early work. It just how these things occupy space. Almost think of them like sculpture, although they're not sculpture. They have huge different implications. But just to try and think about how they're placed in a space, this is Je de Paume. In every space, it's different. This is just putting monitors on the wall, but that too, like how do they fit? What's the size of the room? How much brightness do you want? How does the brightness balance? There's so many questions to think about when you do these things.
I had the privilege of seeing this exhibition, and of course I'm quite familiar with that museum, and the transformation of how your work was installed and seen in that space was really quite amazing to me. As you say, the amount of light, the height of the ceilings, you know, where do you put the chairs, all that kind of thing. I'm sure that occupied you in trying to imagine how people were going to travel through seeing your work.
When they first showed me around, and there was some other show there, but I felt that space as perfect for me. You know, not every space is perfect, but that one felt perfect. Just the different sizes of the rooms, and I just, you know, just felt my work there. Didn't make it an easy installation though. It was very hard, but I just knew it would fit beautifully. This is the culture guest, and back to Jeu de Paume. This
And that's
was
you.
That's me and Antonio Trimani, who has worked with me for 17 years. And now Antonio does most of the work. I'm too old to keep up with him.
This was an interesting piece because it really is about an interface between a body and a non-corporeal existence, it seemed to me.
Yeah, I was thinking about the Egyptian Ba and Ka, you know, where there, and here there was, in that piece, there were 3 different spaces, 3 different kinds of people, you and the 2 reflections.
Mm-hmm.
So tried and figure out how those 3 go together. This is one of my projected stones that I did in 1988, but this was in Culture Guest, which is in Portugal.
So these stones, were they part of the aspect of your work where you kind of stopped doing video and went to straight photography?
Well, they're at the end of that period, or no, sort of in the middle towards the end of that period. They're from 88. I switched in 79 to photography, and I started walking in the woods and started doing landscape work in about 80, 81. But this was kind of, okay, this is back to Kiva at Jeu de Paume. The stonework was at the end of me doing landscapes. And so at the end of me working for 10 years in landscapes, I wound up photographing stones that I'd pick up and haul back to my studio. This is back at the Jeu de Paume. And Valentina Valentini, who's so right to the left, who's so crucial in the development of video in Europe. And Hern Pardee on the right, who has written about my work and is a good artist in his own stead.
So was this exhibition at the Jeu de Paume was a full-on survey of your work? What was it like to kind of walk through your own history like that?
I kept promising myself that it wasn't, because I think at the end of a full-on survey of your work, you just have to die. So I haven't been ready to do that yet.
Retrospective.
So it was very interesting for me, you know, trying to be a non-me observer, to see how the different parts of my work together. So to see what the relationship was between the more recent work and the work from the 70s and 80s. And I must say, this period of isolation for the past 4 or 5 weeks has set me on the same path of reflection. trying to understand. This is me and Antonio, and that's Kiva in the background.
You look like you're giving him some pretty substantial direction here.
Yeah, but he's not buying it. he doesn't believe me one bit. There's a video I have of him where the two of us are in front of interface, and he's kind of shoving me aside. It's all on you now, Antonio.
But you do have some very specific notions of how things should be viewed and experienced in the relationship to the architecture of the room.
Yeah. And I mean, Antonio can do that for his own work, but no one really can do that for mine. It's just my responsibility. And this was the same show in 5 different places, and it was different in each place. Different feel of the place, different space, different light. This in Sevilla was maybe the hardest place to install, but it worked out nicely.
Beautiful. But it does have a very different sensibility.
Right. This is the piece that we saw much earlier in the Jeu de Paume. It was just filled with light. And this is much darker, much more focused piece. It's just different in each place. At one point I said that each piece is the accumulation of every place it's been and every person that's been in front of it. And that for me is a definition of all of these installation pieces.
So they take on a patina of time and history.
Right. Accumulation of time, yeah.
What's going on here?
Oh, it's going to take me a while to tell you. I don't know if I can rush it in. This is a piece where you could never see yourself. As you walked out of the room, your image would appear, but when you walked into the room, your image would disappear. So it's called Door, and it's owned by the San Francisco Museum of Art. I just thought it's, what we experience in life, that we never can really see ourselves, and it's all very, elusive.
I think that's what I meant when I was talking about the physical body and the more the non-corporeal or spiritual body. That seems to be both these pieces are really kind of exploring that same kind of idea, that you're there and not there, that it's a kind of an interior exploration.
Right. Yes, definitely. This is Interface again, but I guess 40 years later, 38 years later. So still the same piece. We use a lot of the same equipment.
So yes. That's you physically, and then you twice in the glass in the mirror?
One is a reflection, and then one is the video image that's projected onto the wall behind. But given the nature of reflection, this is like Newton's optics. They can coexist at the same. There's just one point in the floor where the two intersect each other, because the reflection is 3 dimensions and the video projection on the back wall is 2 dimensions. So it's not till the plane of the back wall intersects with the virtual reflected image from the mirror or the glass, that's where those two come together. But when they come together, it's beyond science. It's really creepy. You feel like you're like some ghost is coming out of you.
It's very interesting. This kind of work is, you really as the maker of it, you really have to have an understanding of the science, the technology, but also, again, how that all comes together with, a more aesthetic or metaphysical way of thinking about things. And, it seems to me to be a very special way of working. My background in art is as a painter, and learning to understand the material. And I know you started out as a painter too. Learning how to understand the material of the paint does give you some freedom to experiment. But when you're working with the kind of technology and science that you're working with, it seems like it could go all over the place.
Yeah, true. So a secret is to just sit down and sit in a space and try to experience it before anything is in there, and try and picture the work. But there are some curators I've worked with, like David Ross curated a show for me in Mexico, and David was just a genius at things like placing pieces in different spaces, and did things in ways that I would never dream of. I mean, there's room for anyone to be creative in that position. Paula Cooper was very good about placing pictures. I mean, you move something 2 inches, one picture from another 2 inches, and it just worked perfectly together. But before you move those 2 inches, it wouldn't. Just having that kind of sensibility, like the chair here, I mean, the bench rather worked perfectly with that particular piece. Took us some time to place the bench.
Yeah, this is a completely different way of experiencing your work. I think this this comes much later, obviously, and you created a little theater for people to come into, almost as though you were back to being a kid and going into the movie theater.
Yeah, except in the movie theater, you had 2 hours of movies that changed every 24 frames per second. And my idea here was what I think of this term in calculus, the XDT, where it's about this slight change with respect to time. And I was trying to have things to change very little, or almost not being able to observe the ways things change. On Saturday afternoon, we used to go to the kiddie theater, and so we have 2 hours of kiddie shows and then 2 hours of features. So that was a lot of watching movies. A little bit like now, I guess, that we're in quarantine.
Yes, we spend a lot of time looking at images on a screen. I thought this was a particularly affecting and effective installation. Nothing really happens much narratively in these pictures, but it's absolutely riveting. It's almost impossible to tear yourself away. And I'm wondering if it's because there is an anticipation that if you leave, you actually are going to miss something. Is that part of what that was about?
I'd have to think about that one. That sounds a little controlling. I mean, I think what I'm trying to do in this work, Convergence, is to go against the experience of movie theaters, so that I had, you walk into a room and there's a video on all 4 walls, and they're all made to go together. But it was trying not to overwhelm someone, trying not to tell them what to look at. There are 4 things that you can look at. I mean, they're related. And I kept putting black in between. Every 40 seconds, there would be some black space, also to try to destroy that kind of narrative time. I mean, movie makers are trying to make money. I understand that. So there was the way I often feel manipulated by the music is something that stops me. So all these things are silent. That particular piece is silent. When I use sound, it's ambient sound. Mm-hmm. But I'm really trying not to overwhelm, not control, not to tell someone what to think. and let them experience that place. At the same time, I think something, and I'm trying to express that. So I have feelings about that particular piece. It was done in a town on the Atlantic coast called Pornic, the French in France, the French Atlantic. And, the town was very dependent on being touristic, and yet there was some fishing and actual fishermen there actually doing the work, actually going out to sea and coming back with fish every day. And yet they were almost like an exhibit in front of the town.
Hmm.
And, I found that rather troubling. But again, I'm not standing up and waving flags and saying that.
Well, there's been a kind of that piece to me sort of signals a bit of a kind of a real serious change in your work. There was the video work, and then in the 1980s, you embarked on your still photography, as you described, driving around in your car, taking pictures, and then it seems like when you started to see ways to work with digital manipulation on the computer and slowing down and pixelizing things. And also, I just wanted to talk a little bit about that early work seemed to be very much about a kind of an interior exploration, almost a psychological one. And then starting with Convergence and then going out into some of the other works that we're going to see in this next tranche of images are all about going outside, a lot of nature, water. What caused that change?
I just couldn't, if we're talking about 1979, I just couldn't do that interior, looking into myself, looking into people's psyches work. And it was, like a breakdown there. And I was in Berlin at the time. And so I was at the Deutsche Akademische Austauschdienst, which is a grant to put people in Berlin at the time for a year. And they put me in a Nazi sculpture studio, which was really a big mistake to put a New York Jew in a Nazi sculptor's studio.
Yes, I think so.
And it was in Dahlem. I wanted to be in the suburbs because I grew up in New York, but when I was 14, the family moved us to Bayside, Queens, and I loved the suburbs. So I've never stopped loving the suburbs. So here I am. And here I am in East Patchogue, the suburbs. Now I must admit I've lost my train of thought, but I'm just about 83, so I think I'm allowed to.
Let's have a look at some of these images that kind of represent this outward-looking approach to nature. I do want to preface this by saying I think of these as being very painterly, and I really like thinking about them in terms of the many landscape paintings that we have in the collection of the parish.
Yes. I called this section for myself the levels of abstraction, because it's something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about, and it is very much about painting. And except instead of dabs of paint, instead of brushstrokes, there are pixels and blocks of pixels. So which I thought was very much referring to, a computer screen, or what I'm working in digital video. That's what I'm working with. I'm basically working with pixels and blocks of pixels, and pixels this way, pixels that way, pixels deep. The deep pixels are how you control the color. So I was trying to relate to video the way a painter would relate to paint. Cézanne was, of course, the person I admire so much. And all of these are around Shinnecock Bay. So this is most definitely Shinnecock Bay. It's observable. The boat, the fishing docks are, I'm about to point to it, which I guess is not the right thing to do here.
We'll just say your finger, that's all.
Yeah. And really interested in color. And so in order to get color to look interesting to me, and if I stood in that spot, you know, for a half hour or so, then I'd start seeing these colors. So when I'd go back to my computer in my studio, I'd be searching for these colors to try and recreate them. They weren't what the eye sees immediately, but what's kind of lurking underneath for me. So abstraction for me was a way to reflect the digital and computer, but also a way to bring out color.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, this is the piece you own.
I know, and I never get tired of looking at it. I could stare at it all day, every day.
When you first showed it, I love that you put it in with paintings, with I think 19th, early 20th century landscape paintings, and
Right.
It was perfect there, I thought. I like to think of my art as being a continuation. That's very important for me, that the work I'm doing just is kind of included in the sweep of art history and just moving it another couple of inches forward. This is probably the most abstract work I did. Just these blocks of color and how they would interact really interested me. I kept looking to see if it's moving, and I realized that we're using slides because of the quality is better than the video. But all these things, all these squares are kind of interacting with each other and moving very slowly.
So we have a question, but it actually backs up a question I was getting ready to ask. Leslie Wayne, who's a painter and a colleague, says, do you see the pixels in your landscape photographs in terms of impressionist painting? And I was going to ask also about decisions about the size of the pixels that you show, because in the one that you just saw right before this one, those big blocks of color very much look like brush strokes.
Right. Just each video, they're not photos, they're videographs. Each videograph takes a long time to decide how abstract it should be.
Mm-hmm.
I worked on this little bastard for about a year.
Wow.
Trying every which way and just never came right. And finally I came up with this. So it had to be pretty closely packed pixels here. When it became, there was too much lost. There's this beautiful sense of line and form in this picture,
Mm-hmm.
this videograph, and doing anything more abstract, you lose all that. Also that, I don't know why I call attention to it, but the beige between the two boats,
Mm-hmm.
right in the center.
Yeah.
I mean, my God, that's hard to come to, you know. So the way I conquered this piece was to work in layers. Instead of just having one layer of video, I would have 4 layers of video and be able to change each layer, and it worked on the layer underneath it. And so I could get a kind of, I don't know, deeper color sense in it.
Do the images give you a hint as to how much they can be abstracted and how you can break it down?
Well, you call it a hint. I think it just yells at me. I think it's just demanding its way. You know, and Michelangelo said that the sculpture was always inside the stone. I feel that way about some of these images, you know, that they're, you know, I just have to take the time to figure out what the image wants.
How long do you, what is the duration of the actual physically recording of the image?
It varies. It can be anywhere from, I don't like it to be shorter than 4 minutes, but it can vary from 4 minutes to 30 minutes. If I'm hand holding it, then sometimes that comes into bear, like how long am I willing to try and be still holding it. If it's on the tripod, then I can go longer. But that.
What about the duration of the playing of the image afterwards? Do you slow it down?
Yes, and that also is determined by what's going on in the image. So if there's a considerable amount of, well, it has to do with how pixelated it is, for one thing. And if the larger the pixels get, the slower it needs to get. Because there's more movement. The larger the chunks of squares are, the slower it has to be. So then I can go down to even 8% of the actual speed. But something that's like this picture would be maybe 25% of the actual speed.
And we have another question, which is, are your images viewed as projections? I'm taking that to mean, very large scale projected on the wall, but I know that you do use monitors as well, and they're different sizes. And I was wondering about scale, and in terms of these images, do the images kind of tell you whether they need to be room sized or 70 by 40, or any other size of a standard screen that you can use? How do you decide?
Well, first comes the intent, and I tend to be conservative. I think I like things to be smaller and tighter, but by intent I mean, is this going to go into a person's home? Is it going to go into a museum gallery? Is it going to, and what's the size of the gallery? Where is it going to be placed? I'm reluctant to project just to project. I mean, that doesn't seem to make any sense to me whatsoever. So a piece like Convergence was already determined by me when I was thinking about it to be projections. A piece like this, I think, is just supposed to be on a monitor. And just, that's what it's supposed to be. So I can't imagine projecting it. However, Head of a Man with Death on His Mind has grown and grown and grown against my tentative objections till I see it and then say, wow, that's really great. So it started off as like 6 feet across, and then it became 8 feet across, and then it became 12 feet across. Lately, I've seen it 20 feet across. So again, it depends on what the situation is. I want to point out that this piece, which I call Virus 1, has to do with being in confinement here, self-confinement, self-imposed confinement. So our forsythia blooms every year, springtime, and this springtime is like no other springtime. But I went out to videograph the forsythia as long as it let me. I mean, it took me a few times to come up with this. And it has beautiful movement in it. I mean, really beautiful, because the wind is just perfect that day. And it goes swinging on its own like it's springtime and it's happy. But I wasn't pleased with it until I made it a little bit dreary because of the times we're in now.
So you do change, you do work on the colors and to get to the feeling of what you want.
Oh yeah, I mean, that's the painter in me. Oh yeah, and that's what takes such a long time. So we have 3 videos here. This is definitely Shinnecock Bay, And in the wintertime, they do dredging. So on the very left side, you can see the dredgers and you can see the crane that's helping them dredge, and the barges on the left. And there's a little bit of movement, and occasionally you can see a little puff of smoke comes out. But talking about the continuum, like I was definitely thinking of, landscape painting of 16th century Flemish landscape painting. Like, can't remember his name exactly. Hype? It's not that exactly. But I wanted this videograph to be in the tradition of those kind of Flemish paintings.
Mhm.
And the palette also.
I was going to say, hence the color palette, which is very Flemish. Nice, rich and gray.
Yeah, Flanders is a wonderful trip to make sometime.
When we can travel again.
Yes. When we can go to the market without wearing face masks. The next piece is Red Fence. Oh, wait, these are 2.5 minutes. So yeah. I was thinking, yeah, there it is.
So
and
very subtly changing in the wind, I guess, right?
Yes, you can see movement in the water. You can see movement on the plastic fencing, but this is from across the bay. This is from the other side of the Ponquag Bridge. This is the Montauk Highway side.
Mm-hmm.
But the light there is so, the East End light is, where do you see light like that? No, nowhere, really. Maybe somewhere in Greece occasionally. It's just spectacular. You just know when you pass a certain point driving to the Hamptons that, oh my God, there's the light.
Yeah, it's true. But the other thing that's interesting to me about this piece is that, you've given huge prominence in the color of of a very mundane and, basically throwaway material, which is, just a piece of plastic sheeting or grid, what do you call it, a net, I suppose, for construction. And yet, abstractly in that way, it just reads very much like a painting.
Well, in any painting, everything's important.
Mm-hmm.
I was about to just say Spinoza, where everything is important. I'm not going to go much deeper than that.
One of our guests wants to know if you would ever consider printing these as still photographs.
And this, by the way, is Virus 2. Right outside our kitchen, we have a Chinese maple. And this was it just started leafing maybe a week before, if that. Now it's in full leaf. And this too, I needed to work on for a while to get the darkness that I felt from what we're going through now. And I constructed it using the way I constructed the line parts of it so that it seems to be splitting apart. This is very much in keeping with, the way I'm feeling. If I turn on the TV, I'd say most of us are feeling now. When I look at Judy Woodruff at PBS, I think, oh my God, she's looking so sad these days. So I wanted it to convey that.
It has a lyricism to it, almost as though it's musical in a way.
Yes. So to go back to the point of, I have printed some things. I wouldn't be me, it would be Kathleen Graves, my beloved spouse, who would print it because she's a master printer and a great artist. And for the Bronx Museum, she made an edition of uh, one of the pieces we showed earlier. And she did it perfectly. She changed a lot of the colors. So it would have to be improved, you know, because my work is in time, and to have something static, there would have to be a change. I know from working as a photographer that I never felt I was up to the task, actually, because my mind and my eye is in change, is in these infinitesimal changes. And in still photography, that notion of change has to be in this one split second. So no and yes, no clear answer, but
No
it's
clear
not the
answer.
same.
But
It's
that's
just
okay.
not the same. I'd have to say, you know, okay, this is something different.
So I have a question here from Kate Petley, who is an artist and a guest curator for the Boulder Museum of Contemporary Art, where she's actually including a work of yours called Night Boy in an exhibition called The Stubborn Influence of Painting, which is scheduled for 2021. And she wants to know if you can talk about your love for Morandi's landscapes and any common ground that you feel with his work.
Yeah, I love Morandi. I first ran into Morandi, I think, in somebody's house, a watercolor he did, in oh, I mean, when I saw it was in the late 70s. I have since then found out that he, you know, he was an Italian and that he had Nazi sympathies, or those sympathies anyway, fascist sympathies. So that cooled me a little bit on him, but I think that he's brilliant. I prefer his landscapes to the works of his with bottles and glasses. I mean, I know what he was doing, and I think the use of negative space was extraordinary. But his landscapes, which I hear he did by looking out of his window using binoculars, so they have that flattening of space that's really gorgeous. And when is Italy not going to look anything but gorgeous anyway? So, but Morandi taught me so much about, well, not just color, but negative space and flattening of space. I mean, I thought he was an extraordinary painter. Not seen so much in the U.S., I think.
Not so much.
Uh,
There was a nice little Morandi show at the Metropolitan Museum not too long ago.
yeah, and I missed it.
Going to his house and seeing the paintings in situ is really quite an experience.
Yeah. It's always, to know what someone's politics is always difficult.
Like Wagner.
Or Céline, you know, who wrote these wonderful, wonderful French prose, but just such a Nazi.
So we're getting close to the end, but I wanted to read something else that you had written that I wanted you to comment on. You said, "I live a life that could easily be explained as paralleling right brain and left brain activity. On the right side, I'm an artist, plumbing the deep, dark pools of unconscious creativity. And on the left brain side, a professor of art at a university, following the dictates of logical reasoning." Is there a place where that meets in the middle?
Corpus callosum, which is the pathway over the brain that connects the two halves. Well, I was definitely better at the right brain stuff than the left brain stuff. I was not a great professor. I don't know why. I mean, I think my work, particularly the abstract work, just shows that I like the more gestalt view of things, less specific things. And but they're both there. I mean, they're both about organization, and I have a strong formalist side to me, and I think that would probably be left brain. So, I mean, we use both sides. I mean, the receptors in the eye are also different. You have the fovea, which is very, very detailed, and then you have your peripheral vision, which is a really different kind of cell in the eye. And so if the eye can have both, I guess I can have both.
Well, if you can have science and art, you can have left brain and right brain. And you taught for 30 years, so you must have been a very good professor.
Well, I don't know. I'm sure a lot of people would argue with that, but you know, it was a way for me as an artist to continue being an artist, and I think it serves that purpose for a lot of artists. It's a good employer.
Jason Barone says that you were an absolutely great professor.
Yes, we worked out a comedy routine that Jason and I did in classes. Whatever I'd say, he would say, no, that's not true. I'd say something which I thought was profound. I'd look over at Jason and be, no, oh God, how could you even say that? No, I had some really good students, Jason being one of them.
Well, he's listening to you tonight, so he obviously thought you were good. No. Peter, I want to really thank you for being with us. This has been very illuminating for me. I love talking with you about your work. I'm looking forward to getting your piece back up sometime soon, and hopefully when we reopen, we can move ahead with a project with you that you and we've been talking about, so that all of our audience out here will get a chance to see all of this work in real life.
Thank you so much for having me, and it's been a really interesting experience, very unique, and I hope to have an opportunity to do more discussions like this, but it's just really unusual and fun. Thank you.
It is fun, isn't it? It's also good to see you in your house and see what you have surrounding you. It's just it's kind of a warm and human way of having a nice conversation. So I really appreciate it, and thank you all so much for being part of this tonight. There were more than 100 of you participating in this program, and we really appreciate your joining us. We're sorry that we can't see you in real life. This is not even close to being as good, but it also has some upsides to it. I'm wearing jeans.
No, I had no idea.
Well, I am wearing pants. Thank you, Peter. I hope to see you again very soon.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody. Thank you so much. And thanks to Bank of America, to the Corcoran Group, and to Steve and Sandy Pearlbinder for helping make this evening possible.